Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Quisha King Show, where we discuss faith, culture, and politics, all geared for the next generation. Today, I have a very special guest for you. But before I tell you who this special guest is, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And also, if you're listening to this in audio mode, make sure you download the episode. All right, everybody. So today we have a very special guest. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you to Michael Strong.
Thank you, Quisha. Great to be here. I love your introduction. I love your enthusiasm. This is going to be fun.
Yes, it is. So, thank you first. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. You are so well versed in unschooling, in the education field, public schools, just a wealth of information. So, I'm really glad that you're here to help educate America and American students on what the opportunities are that are available to them outside of your traditional public school. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I love your concept of a mass exodus. I think that conventional public schooling is harmful for maybe 80% of kids. I think there are some places where it's working, and I think the people who support it, and there are many, of course, it's because their particular school for their particular kid is working, and good for them. I'm glad it's working for some people, but I think for the vast majority of kids, it's somewhere between a little bit harmful and extremely harmful. So happy to get into that.
Yeah. So could you tell us just a little bit of background? How did you get into this world? Like, what did you see? Just tell us about yourself.
Sure. So it's a long history. People don't know Mortimer Adler, but Mortimer Adler was a very famous 20th century intellectual. He wrote a book called How to Read a Book, which was very famous. He introduced something called the Paideia proposal in the 1980s. And the idea was to bring kind of classical education into public schools. And so I started working for the Paideia Project in inner city Chicago in the late 1980s. And part of the proposal was Socratic dialogue, where I would go into classrooms and get kids thinking and talking about ideas. And they came to life. It was beautiful, just really passionate and so forth. From there, I became a Socratic teacher trainer in Alaska public schools under the Alaska Paideia Project. And what I found was that most kids are really bored in school. And it sounds banal because, if you look at school, a lot of people were bored, but we forget about it. We, as adults, we get into our life and so forth, and we completely forget about it. So it was very powerful for me to go into these classrooms. Eventually I wrote a book, The Habit of Thought, from Socratic seminars to Socratic practice. I conducted in-service trainings for, hundreds of schools across the US, and I've been in hundreds of classrooms across the US. And this was back in the 1990s. I became acutely aware of just how disengaged most students were. And later I'll get into why that's a serious moral problem. But to continue my own narrative, from Alaska Paideia Project, some parents asked me to start a private school, so I became an educational entrepreneur by accident. So I created the Athenaeum School in Anchorage almost 30 years ago with some colleagues. Then I left to work for a Montessori school in San Antonio. And then I created a gift school for highly gifted children in South Florida, Fort Lauderdale area. I created Montessori middle schools in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley. I then created a charter high school in Angel Fire, New Mexico, which was ranked the 36th best public high school in the US based on advanced placement scores. I then did a detour. I met John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods, and he and I had both been passionate believers in entrepreneurship. He created a grocery store. I created a bunch of schools. And so I spent about a decade working on entrepreneurial solutions to world problems. That's where I met my wife, the Senegalese entrepreneur who is solving problems in Africa. And then I got back into education a decade ago, and I combined the kind of entrepreneurship plus the Socratic for what was originally Co-School. That then was replaced by the Academy of Thought and Industry, the largest high school, the largest Montessori chain, the high school model for the largest Montessori chain in the US. And then 2 years ago when COVID hit, I went virtual to create the Socratic Experience. And it's a virtual K through 3 3 through 12 education, modeled after my previous work, and we are designed to help identify, to develop and discover the genius in your child. We work with entrepreneurial, creative, and intellectual children and have a blast doing so. So that's a super, basically, I've been all over. I've seen all kinds of things. I know education from 100 different directions.
Right. So you're the perfect person to be having this conversation with.
Exactly.
So, wow. So how many years did you say that you've been doing this?
35. Basically,
35.
I've been in education 35 years. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when you started to see that children were bored, and like, what was that moral problem that you saw?
Yeah, let me kind of jump into the big picture solution. I'll go into the problem. So I
Okay.
think, first of all, I think adolescence in the United States is a catastrophe, just a catastrophe. And some of it, anxiety, depression, suicide, some
Yeah.
of it, substance abuse, addictive behaviors of all kinds, things like cutting, self-harm,
Yes.
anorexia. And part of this is, again, my wife is from Senegal. Their teenagers are healthy and strong. It's a very, very poor country. But teenagers do not have all of these, I would say, sad and unfortunate behaviors. And so I do think our culture is unhealthy, sick,
Yeah.
and
I think
especially for teens. And
I
a lot
agree.
of this gets into meaning, purpose, and community. So whether it's faith or whether it's some other sorts of meaning and purpose, adolescents without meaning and purpose are prone to all sorts of pathologies. And there's a research based on the community side that if teenagers feel connected to their school and to their parents, they're much less likely to be at risk of all of these kinds of things. And so we spend millions, I'm sure hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on, gangs and teenage pregnancy and substance abuse and anxiety, depression, all these things. And yet I think at bottom, when we can help young people have meaning, purpose, and community, most of that disappears. And then finally, that comes from my own experience. For decades, I brought children who were unhappy in various ways into small, purpose-driven schools. And within a few weeks, sometimes months, they're no longer anxious, depressed. They go off the meds, all of this sort of thing. So I see, healthy meaning and purpose in community is absolute non-negotiables for adolescent well-being. And public schools are not providing that for the majority of our children. Actually, just to rant one more time on this,
Sure.
to give scale, there's data from Yale a couple of years ago. This is pre-COVID. 75% of teenagers are unhappy in high school. You think, what other business? McDonald's couldn't get away with it with 75% unhappy customers.
Right.
There's nowhere where 75% unhappy. My own perception of teenagers disengaged 25 years ago in public schools. Gallup did a poll pre-COVID. 2/3 of kids are not engaged in schools. So whenever I hear people talk about, oh, this pedagogy or this, education reform or, this new thing, and like 2/3 of them are tuned out. You got 2/3 that are tuned out. It doesn't matter what you're doing. We're again, purpose, meaning, and community. So I'll pause from the rant right there, but you get it.
Well, I will say that my new discovery of John Taylor Gatto and this whole Prussian school model has really just blown my mind, thinking that, or understanding that schools aren't broken. They're actually functioning how they were meant to function. Public schools are not broken. And I think when we realize that whole like school reformation and, we just, fix the school boards and all this stuff. And it's like, I think that's helpful maybe to hold back some of the crazy stuff. But as a whole, like, I don't know how you fix something that's not broke. Like, how do you fix that? Because, we can see in one of John Taylor Gatto's books, I think it was The Mass Educate, I forget which one. I've been going back and forth between two of them, but he was talking about how before public school, the mass public school started, they did a query on the men that were going into the army or into the military, and I think it was something like the high 80s, 90s, something, a high number. And I think it was like maybe even 95%, 97% of those men were literate. just like a decade after like the public school just explosion. It was a very short period of time, and I need to go back and remember exactly, but that number had dropped to like 85%. Like it had dropped by like 15% just in like a decade. And that was only for fourth grade. They were not literate at the fourth grade level. And then at like 10 years or 15 years after that, it dropped even more. And it's just been getting less and less. And so the data has been there for decades that this mass public school, the way we do it, is not making kids smarter. It's not making kids it's not healthy. We see the deterioration of culture, and and if 90% plus, I think it's a little less now because people are pulling their kids out, people are having a mass exodus. But you see that most Americans go through the public school system, and we wonder why the culture is so terrible. So I mean, the proof is there, but there's so much money in public school. So it's hard. How are you going to fix that?
It's huge. So a great version on your side. Let me start with the Gatto. So first, okay. John Taylor Gatto, absolutely required reading. Yeah, and his most famous book is Dumbing Us Down. There's one chapter that is absolutely required reading, The 7 Lesson School Teacher. Everyone who's interested in education has to read that. The short version, he talks about emotional dependence and intellectual dependence.
Yeah.
Basically, school is it's training people in how to be passive and dependent. And anyone who's successful in the world takes initiative, gets things done, is responsible. And so whenever, I coach parents on looking at, are their children doing well? I don't care about their grades. Are they taking initiative? Are they being responsible? Are they being powerful, an empowered moral being? And just going back to work, things like, working as a teen. I think teenagers need to work. They need to be responsible.
Yeah.
If school is basically telling them what to do all day, they are not going to be competent. I look at all these people who graduate from college and work at Starbucks for 2 or 3 years to find themselves. Imagine how much time had been wasted because they never learned to take responsibility and initiative. Wow. Yeah. Conversely, I know hundreds of people without high school or college degrees who are incredibly successful. And it's because they have learned to take charge of their own life. So, in addition to kind of the substance abuse and over-sexualization of the classroom and all that, the very basic thing of, is your kid learning to be a responsible, mature adult, or is school infantilizing him or her? And I think school completely infantilizes people.
I was talking to Deb Philman. She runs The Reason We Learn. She's homeschooled from like the very beginning of her kids. I think most of them are adults now, if not all of them. And she was talking about how when she was in graduate school, she wanted to be a teacher, and they were talking about, everything is like, you have to it's co-learning, and like the teachers just supposedly just right there by your side. There is no real independence. There's nothing to make the child figure things out, like really figure it out for themselves. They just, okay, here's the lesson. The kid may or may not understand it, probably doesn't. They are so insecure that they don't want to say, hey, I really don't understand this. The teacher's like off making TikTok videos on her phone at her desk with her lesson plan or whatever. And so everybody, like, everything is just so disconnected that the child who, naturally you're going to have that phase where you do feel a little, less confident, and you need an environment that fosters you to, push forward and take a risk, and, not feel like I can't say I don't know, or be in search for, answers, and be curious and wanting to think. But teachers themselves these days are not even promoting that curiosity. It's just like, sit there, shut up, and listen, and don't talk. And, it's just it's not an environment that's conducive to educating. And like, it's just, when you think about it, none of this really makes sense, Michael. It just doesn't even make sense. It's
an insane bureaucratic machine that, and it's gotten worse over the decades. So kind of going way back, people sometimes talk about Thomas Jefferson as justifying, public education. What Jefferson said is we need an educated populace, not public education. His
Right.
proposal was basically small town private schools where there would be some scholarships for the poor kids. And so at no point did he envision large scale government control over education. That came in with Horace Mann and the Prussian system.
Yeah.
Horace Mann in Massachusetts in the mid 19th century brought the
Yeah.
Prussian system, where all of a sudden the State Department of Education was created and there was this top down control. Even then, it was just a few hours a day, a few months a year. Because agricultural is still important, but gradually it ratcheted up to more hours a day, more years, and so forth. It was only in the 1930s that most kids started to go to high school, and only in the 1950s that most kids graduated from high school.
Yeah.
And one of the things I point out is the whole notion of adolescent rebellion and teen dysfunction really dates from the 1950s. Rebel without a cause and juvenile delinquents. Back when young people worked, we didn't have teenagers acting out like this.
No.
They'd milk the cows and take care of business and be responsible, healthy young adults. So the whole history of adolescent dysfunction is closely tied with the history of mass public schooling. And then finally, there was the school consolidation movement where in 1920, there were 200,000 school districts. So even though it was public schools, they were very community-based, but
Right.
there was this movement towards bigness, and by 1970 there were only 20,000 school districts, so an order of magnitude decrease, which meant now we have these large, monstrous public school districts, completely impersonal. I would say the public school districts that work better, in my experience, tend to be much smaller. A small rural community where it's still responsive, or occasionally there's a small suburban or urban. It's just, I knew the human resource director of Miami Public Schools once, and I believe he said they had like 1 million teachers. And he said his job was basically sending a drunk teacher home every day. When you have these romantic notions of teachers, but, and I don't know if you saw, an estimated 10% of students are sexually abused at schools. The scale, there's this romantic, public schools, but the fact is it's a disaster in so many different ways.
You are so right. I recently saw there was a compilation of headlines of all these teachers that have been arrested for like sexual abuse. And I was like, wow, like even here in Duval County, like we had a city councilman's son who was, a teacher in an elementary school that found he's a pedophile. He's a pedophile and had been teaching for years. And it's like, I think you are so right. That is spot on. We romanticize the idea of teachers. We romanticize the idea of public schools. These people are strangers. You do not know them. This is not like Susie, Mrs. Honey from Matilda, where she's, it's all nice and sweet. And she, the teacher is like your neighbor. And it's like, you knew her grandparents and, you watched her grow up and now she's back from college and now this is not that, And so I think we need to really realize you do not know who these people are. They are absolute complete strangers. And on what planet, when we really actually sit down and think, I am going to send my child 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 12 years at minimum to a complete stranger to have them be discipled, taught, whatever, you have really no idea because they're strangers. Like when you think about it in a different way, you would never do that. As a parent.
It's big. Just a correction, it was only about 20,000 teachers in Miami-Dade public schools, but still a drunk one every day. But going back to the strangers issues, one of the problems is that often a lot of the best teachers are chased out by the bureaucracy. So, because things are so tightly controlled, I'm very supportive of teachers. Public school teachers are heroic, but very often the ones who want to do the most that are positive get dragged down by all of the bureaucratic controls. And so what tends to happen is those sometimes who care the least are the ones who stay. We all have seen teachers who basically, as you say, TikTok videos are basically tuned out. We hand out worksheets and ignore the class for the rest of the hour. hour. For those, it's a cushy job that's pretty well paid, and get summers off. Whereas there are conscientious ones, but they're fighting the system. And one thing people don't talk enough about is how school choice is going to liberate the teachers. I think the best teachers should be aggressive advocates for school choice, because then they can create schools that care.
Right.
I like to say we need schools based on love, and everything based on love has to be voluntary. It needs to be people who share something in common. They need to share a moral vision, a community vision, a set of norms, and
Yeah.
a shared sense of decency. And
Yeah.
I see school choice allowing millions of wonderful teachers to work with millions of wonderful families to create much healthier subcultures. And I think it's an exciting time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I see a lot of the SEL, the critical race theory. I see those creeping into pretty much any place that not every single school, not every single charter school, not every single private school, obviously. But what concerns me is that the money that is tied to government, because all these things are all governed like top down from the federal government. A lot of these programs, this critical race theory, SEL, like a lot of the survey, the crazy survey, like all of this stuff, a lot of it comes from federal grants. And when they're using public money, taxpayer dollars to for school choice, I'm still an advocate for school choice. However, it does worry me that with that money that is tied, it's still like these things are still creeping in. And it's kind of like I feel like I'm in a rock and a hard place, because I would still advise. I think it's still better to pull your child out of a public school and put them in a charter school. At least you do have a little bit more say. You have or a private school, you have a little bit more say. You can look your principal directly in the eye. You can actually walk into the school, But I think parents need to be careful with that too. I think some of the things that I hear parents say now, it's like, okay, well, I'm pulling them out. It's like, whew, they're in a private school, they're in a charter school, and I'm like, okay, I'm not trying to be the bearer of bad news, but we should never have let our guard down when we're sending our children somewhere outside of their home. And so I think we need to, regardless of where they are,
Right.
we need to be vigilant as parents and make sure that we know exactly what is going on with our kids. And I do. So I am seeing some of this stuff trickle into these, charter schools and private schools. And that's like, oh, I hate that.
Huge. So first, on the policy side, I would agree. I'm very much the only criterion of accountability in school choice should be parent interest. So if the parents want it, obviously no abusive situations, but beyond that, I have no faith in the establishment at all. I think the establishment is problematic for all the reasons you mentioned and 100 more. And so, they are the schools of education and the big granting agencies and the federal government. You're right. They all have a similar worldview, and they're not focused on the needs of the parents or students. They're focused on their own beliefs. And parents know best what's good for their child. And then going back to your thing, never let somebody else take care of them. Just to the most basic level, I encourage parents to think, would I hire this child? And even when they're 11, 12, 13, I actually think middle school damages so many kids. A lot of times elementary kids are still, they're still kind of hopeful and optimistic.
Yeah.
Some kids are harmed in elementary, but middle school is a
cesspool.
Yeah, it's a cesspool. And, the vulgarity and, exposure to sex and drugs and bullying. I've often said the best thing for school choice is if we had live cams in the restrooms and lunch cafeterias of public schools, because the brutality is unbelievable. And, parents do a good job of raising their children up in a moral environment. And then they put them in these toxic environments, with complete lack of awareness. And so you think of your sweet, innocent, wonderful child that you put so much heart and care in, and you're exposing them to the worst elements. It's interesting. People are worried about, diseases and, additives in the food and, all kinds of things people are afraid of. But what Ralph Waldo Emerson said, I pay the schoolmaster to teach my child, but it's the schoolboys who actually educate him. And I think everybody knows peer pressure is huge, but you need to think, if you could listen to everything that happened in your child's middle or high school, would you actually want your child exposed to this? If you had a choice between, and they're not going to tell you, your kid's not going to tell you about, the porn they were exposed to, or that they were offered drugs, or that they, got insulted or bullied, or, a thousand terrible things. So kind of going back to the homeschooler thing, often people say, oh, homeschooler, they're not socialized. Most of my schools have attracted some homeschoolers because it does become trickier in high school. They're the best socialized. In my experience, homeschool kids are more mature, more responsible, more thoughtful in every way. And part of it is they spent more time with adults. It was insane to have, all of the seventh graders together. If, Lord of the Flies was written by a middle school teacher. You don't put a bunch of immature kids together and let them rule each other. So pause on that rant and let you go.
No, that is so true. I've been reading, more about that. Like I didn't really even think about that before, but I think my oldest daughter is more mature because I was a stay-at-home wife and mother for when she was like really little, and so she was around like more adults. She was, got exposed to, like different vocabulary. I think that definitely helped her. And I always push them to be a lot more independent and not just like rely on mom. Like, I'm not going to be here forever, and I want you to be able to survive and think. And so I'm always, instead of just, oh, mom, how do you do this? I'm like, you have like a gazillion resources at your disposal. Like, you really can figure this out for yourself. And just like getting kids around other age groups, and another, I think this ties in too. You have one child, let's say, is you in this big classroom setting, or let's say you have a couple kids that are like in 10th grade math, but it's a 7th grade class. You are forcing them to literally just be stuck in this one thing when they are ready for something else. And I think that contributes to behavior problems too, because the teacher's explaining it. They got it and understood it 2 days ago before you even explained it to the rest of the class. They've moved on in their head, so they're like, okay, yeah, what can I get into now? Like, what's going on? Because you're not challenging. Everything is built for one type of student, and that is just stupid.
Big time. I couldn't agree with you more. And the great thing about homeschooling, microschooling, there are a lot of solutions where you can go at the child's own pace. I've had students in my school who are right. Maybe one student is ahead 4 or 5 years in math and behind in reading, or another student's ahead 4 or 5 years in reading and behind in math. We can personalize. With technology, it's so easy to personalize. But you're exactly right. One size fits all. For me, secondary school were the most boring and cruel years of my life. As an adult, I've never been as bored as I was in school. Not once. Maybe the dentist's office or DMV. DMV is the closest thing, and that's what, once every few years you have to spend a day in DMV. But school's like that every day, all the time. And you're right. That makes them much more prone to, getting stoned or picking on each other, or reading bad things, whatever it is. If you're bored, healthy human beings not bored. Let me give you one more thing. There's a famous experiment called Rat Park, where they got rats addicted to cocaine, and they were in cages. But then they let them free in a park where they could go roam and explore and be in nature and everything. And they lost interest in cocaine. And so I think addiction, something as hardcore addiction as that, if you put people in a cage, especially when they're at the most powerful and energetic period of their life, of course they're gonna do drugs and that kind of stuff. It's kind of a way to compensate for the pain. Let me give you one more anecdote, just because it's coming up for me.
Sure.
Years ago, I met this, I was working in a classroom in Alaska. I met this Native American kid, 7th grade, 6'2", incredibly strong and powerful. And it was having a hard time connecting with him. So finally, because Socratic dialogue, we'd get kids talking, and finally asked him, what does he love? And he said, I love to fight. And it turns out that, he'd go out on the playground or the parking lot after school, and 7th grade is bigger than everybody, so he can beat the crap out of everybody. But it brought him alive. You could see the eyes coming alive and how excited he was. And and it was voluntary. He wasn't kind of picking on people. It's like,
Mhm.
young
Yeah.
males, let's do it.
Right.
And I thought, in a traditional society, in a Native American society, if they found a big, powerful young man like this, they would celebrate him. He'd be the one who's
Mhm.
out hunting the walrus and the polar bear and like
Right.
a hero. And we keep this kid who's an incredibly powerful human being, basically in
Mhm.
fluorescent lights by an insecure, old woman teacher,
Yeah.
and humiliating him all day. And so I think
Mm.
what people don't realize is many of our best and brightest, most capable people are young people who are being humiliated by the school system, and this
Mm.
doesn't even pay attention to this. I mean, talk about a school to prison pipeline. I think a
Oh,
lot of it is let's humiliate strong young men for 7 years and see what happens. Are you
right.
insane? Are you insane? But that's
Right.
what we're doing.
Yeah. That's so, yeah, we're like, we are criticizing, harshly criticizing some of our most unique individuals, the ones who, because they don't fit it into the norm. But those, like, typically those are the people that go on to do really incredible things. They weren't meant, they were made like that. Like, I believe God just made people, you're just unique, and I think we're all uniquely different. That's why having one way to educate a child is absolutely absurd. But this has turned into, instead of being, the sort of libertarian American idea where you're free to express yourself and be the individual, it's like, no, the individual is bad. And we see that en masse today. Like, you can't say that. You can't think. You have to do it. You have to fall exactly in line with what everybody else is doing, or you're bad. And it's so sad that we are destroying the one nation that was meant to foster individuality.
Big time. And going back to these kids, the uniqueness, a lot of entrepreneurs and creatives hate school. So,
Yeah.
famously, Steve Jobs dropped out of college. Yeah. Bill Gates dropped out of college. John Mackey of Whole Foods dropped out of college. Richard
Mhm.
Branson's a high school dropout.
Yep.
A lot of the people that have been most successful in entrepreneurship hated school and left. Paul Graham, who founded Y Combinator, the most successful tech incubator in the world,
Yeah.
he constantly writes on how bad school is. And then creatives, I work with a lot of professional creatives, marketing, ad directors, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
A lot of them didn't find their talent fulfilled in school. And so if you think that the 21st century belongs to our entrepreneurs and creatives, and they're being crushed in school, and of course, this is where social mobility is thing. If they come from a certain kind of family, a certain class, okay, they can drop out of school and succeed, or they can stay with school but still have the support. But I
Yeah.
think that there are millions of brilliant young people whose spirit is being crushed and destroyed in the system. And yeah, we just pathologize them. We say, oh, even things like ADHD and dyslexia, a lot of entrepreneurs are ADHD, dyslexia, and so forth.
I have
Hello.
ADHD.
Exactly. I have like 50 browser tabs open and doing a million things. And yeah, they
Yep.
would so drug me with Ritalin if I was in school today. You
Oh
know,
God.
that's what they do to kids. It's terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, um, it is so true. Like, I just remember, as you're talking, I remember, like, just being so out of place, and so many different things in my life, especially in school, because I was just like, now that I know I have ADHD, like, I didn't know, like, why my mind was going like 50 miles an hour, but my mouth wasn't even, like, it wasn't, my mind was going faster than my mind, and it wasn't keeping up. And so, but people would, like, okay, what, like, I wouldn't, anyway, I can get into a whole thing on that. But it is very sad that those things are missed, and they're not, we're not catching, like, oh, there's something unique here. Like, I love to talk. Like, I would get in trouble all the time for talking, because I was a very curious child, and I had a lot of questions. Like, I'm like, oh, what about this, what about it was just always asking. I would drive my mother crazy, I still do that. Like, I am still that way today. And so, I mean, I try to be a little bit better, but just, that was just how I
Yeah,
am. And it was
it's
just
huge.
really,
Actually,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, it's huge. Actually, my wife's a big talker too, and she's a great entrepreneur now. And talking. It's funny. We tell kids to shut up in K-12. A lot of successful people are talking all the time. Adult professional life is talking all the time. You're selling, you're negotiating, you're building relationships,
Yeah.
It's funny. A lot of talking is one of the superpowers of adult professional life, and we
Yeah.
don't let kids do it in school. It's
Yeah.
insane. So, my school, we talk all the time.
Yeah,
Um,
words, that's how we can I was always I was like, everything is like, I had this epiphany when it was like, everything is built around words, you write when you're writing, it's words, you're reading, it's words, you're talking, it's words. It's like, I'm like, where if you are good, if you can master words, like you can do so many great things. Anyway, I know you have to run, but I want you to tell us, if you could, really quick, for people who don't know, what is the Socratic method or Socratic experience, or how do you tie those two together? I know that there is an actual Socratic method, and also where they can find you and what you have upcoming, anything you want to share with our audience.
Terrific. Thank you, Quisha. So SocraticExperience.com, K3 through 12 virtual school. And Socratic is asking questions. Our basic format, I went to St. John's College, Great Books College, so lots of classic texts from different world civilizations. But we read and discuss texts, and we ask students, basically, what is the true, the good, and the beautiful in a million different ways. We study Shakespeare or Plato or Confucius or whatever, and get to think about serious moral and intellectual issues, and get them to examine text. But also there's kind of a learning to read challenging material, understanding where cultural and civilization come from, and really getting them to think for themselves and be responsible for their own thoughts and ideas. So it's really fun. Most kids love it because they're talking all the time.
Yeah.
We do have a summer program for people who want to test drive it. We also encourage parents to come and visit classrooms if they want to come and watch. But I personally love talking, love dialogue, love thinking with other people.
Yeah.
And I think most people do, and it really empowers them to do amazing things. So SocraticExperience.com. I love helping families. And if your child is not flourishing, definitely consider some option right away.
That is so amazing. Thank you for all the work that you've put in over, over 3 decades. I mean, that's just incredible. And I just can't thank you enough for even just coming on and chatting with us. Hopefully we can do this again sometime, and we can have a even expanded conversation, because there's so much I can tell, like this conversation could just go, and I really want to arm parents, concerned citizens, aunts, uncles, everybody who cares about children and their education with information like what you have. So thank you so much, Michael, for coming on. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Quisha. It's really fun, and I can't wait to do it again. And we'll keep exploring all the wonderful possibilities once we transcend the current dead system.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.